Hi, welcome to lesson 5. Today is the first of 2 lessons about historiography, and it refers directly to pages 49 to 59 in your book. This lesson will help you write the paragraphs about your historians. Now, in the last lesson we looked at primary and secondary sources and how we can use that to say whether an historian is a credible historian, whether they're believable, whether they're reliable. Okay. Today we're going to look at how an historian's background and environment influences how they write history and whether that has influenced their perspective on your individual. So we're going to look at what is historiography, what influences an historian and how they write, and some examples of how perspectives on one event can differ according to who the historian is, why they wrote, and when they wrote. Okay, so what is historiography? Historiography is the history, of how history is written. Okay. In modern history, modern historical studies, we assume that history is not objective. The event may have happened, but how the event is written is always biased because it's written by a person. And people are not robots. People come with biases and agendas and prejudice. Okay? So what we assume is that history is written and created by people who are not robots, people who have a point of view, okay? And because history is written by people, it's never objective, because people are influenced by their own ideas and their education and where they grew up and when they grew up. So the key idea is that all historians have their own perspectives on an event. So how do you determine an historian's perspective or the influences on what they wrote? Well, you look at when they wrote their history, why they wrote their history, where they lived and where they were educated, and what sources did they use. Okay, so last week we looked at the sources and how primary sources are generally considered more reliable than secondary sources. Today we're going to look about how a person's life stories and background and when they're actually writing can influence what they write. And because we acknowledge that an historian's background and their education and their experiences influences their writing of history, that's why in the essay we write a short biography of the historian and we try and relate that to their perspective on the individual. Okay, so let's look for an example at Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin was the leader of the USSR during the Cold War era, which was the 1950s, and during the Second World War. During the Cold War, the United States and Russia were the 2 biggest countries on the planet, and several times they almost came to nuclear war. Now, historians write about Stalin in different ways. So if we look at an American historian writing in the 1950s during the Cold War, if he was a Republican, he would probably write that Stalin was an evil dictator wanting to destroy the free world. However, a Russian historian at the same time, during the 1950s, who was a member of the Communist Party, would most probably write that Stalin was a great leader who saved the country during the Second World War. Now, this is an extreme example, but it shows how an historian's perspective is influenced by when they grew up, where they live, and where they were educated. Okay, so let's look at some examples in the booklet between pages 53 and 56 in the book. What we have here are two accounts of the First World War, of a military action during the First World War. The one on page 55 to 56 is an article published in the Sydney Morning Herald during the First World War, and the article was written by C.W. Bean, who was the official war correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald. The other account is by a First World War soldier. It's from his diary, and it's on page 53 to 54. Now, if you read C.W. Bean's small article, he was the official writer for the Australian Press Corps during the war, during the First World War. He was writing for Australian audiences at home, so for somebody in Sydney who perhaps had a husband or a brother who was actually there in Europe during the First World War. So when he wrote his articles, his aim was to support the war effort and to keep the people at home informed but not alarmed, alert but not alarmed. Okay, so if you read his account, you'll say that it does not mention the horror or the reality of the war. It's quite upbeat. It talks about how bravely the soldiers fought and how they won that particular action. The second extract is a diary written by a soldier who was actually fighting on the front lines during the First World War. Now, the soldier wrote the diary maybe for himself or maybe for his family, but he didn't expect it to be made public. So there was no purpose for writing this except for personal reasons. And if you read this, you'll see that it's a record of a similar situation that Bean wrote about, but it actually talks about the horrible reality of the war. So you can see how a description of what is a similar event can be quite different according to the writer's environment, their purpose, their audience, or their political bias, or the reason why they're writing their account. So it's the same with your historians. Your historian's background, their experiences as a human being, influences the way they write about your individual. And when you analyse your historians, you should be aware of that fact. So it's important to approach all written histories with a critical attitude, right? You look at the author's situation, where and when they wrote, why they wrote, who they wrote for, and that way you can analyse their perspectives on your individual, okay? I spoke about Joan of Arc in a previous lecture. Now, a Catholic priest writing about Joan of Arc will write about Joan of Arc as a Catholic saint, that she was holy, that she heard the voice of God. Obviously, the fact that this person is a Catholic and that Joan of Arc is a saint will influence the way they write about Joan of Arc. Somebody writing about Joan of Arc who is not a Catholic or who is a feminist will see Joan of Arc in a different way. So the reason we write a paragraph about the biography of the historian is so you can relate their experiences and their education to their perspective on your individual. And when you come to analysing their perspectives and comparing and contrasting the perspectives of the historians, you use their background as a way to analyse their perspectives. I hope that makes sense. Okay, if you have any questions, get back to me about it. Okay, send me an email and we can discuss it. Okay? Next week, we will be talking about historiography in a much broader sense. It's very interesting. See you then. Bye.